miracle wheat, and more. Who was John A. Bonnet? In our secret Watchtower newspaper discussion that we had, we talked about Bonnet a little bit. He was the one who was in charge of the Watchtower Cemetery plot and the Watchtower Farm in Allegheny. Here's the one about Pilgrim J. A. Bonnet. In the Society's farm and cemetery near Pittsburgh, has room as a future home for two capable truth sisters on Bible house terms. Same as at Bethel, and will be glad to hear from a mother and daughter or two sisters. He wants 2 or 3 truth brethren with good physical ability to join him on the Society's cemetery farm service on the Bible house terms and make the place their future home. And the photo, that's the grave of Russell with the farmhouse at the bottom. You'll see that that is at the Watchtower Cemetery plot. So right at the, Russell's buried up on the hill, right at the bottom of the hill is where Bonnet's home was. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides.
Which is now what everybody questions, is that a Masonic temple?
Yeah, there's a Masonic temple right at the bottom of the hill now.
Where the farm used to be.
Where the farm used to be. But a couple of years before the pyramid is built there, that marked the grave sites, there's also that shot of Abbott sitting on the porch there. So that's a very important historical photograph there. Now we're going to get into a little more detail about him because he's very involved in this miracle wheat story. There's several photos of Bonnet that we were able to find. He was also one of the Watchtower lecturers. Here he's talking about the Great Pyramid or Bible in stone and God's provision for the heathen. What happens to the millions of heathen that are dying every day in Christless despair? Where will they spend eternity? So that's a very interesting topic for discussion. Now, Bonnet was the oldest of 5 children. Their father was a blacksmith, and his father died at the age of 96 in 1927. So he had a good long life. His death notice is in the New Era Enterprise of March 1927. That's his death certificate there. Bonnet explains how he brought his family into the Watchtower belief in one of his articles. So the St. Paul Enterprise has an article, August 27th, 1915, How Pilgrim Bonnet Got Present Truth. In the article, he basically says he grew up as a farmer in Michigan, and when he grew tired of farming, he moved to Portland, Oregon. And on a business failure, he claims he could have easily become a millionaire if he had stuck to his business that failed. But my religious proclivity suffered a shock and was downward. He lost his faith in the Bible. But he heard a preacher, a John Hector of San Francisco, who, having delivered a stirring sermon in defense of the Bible, climaxed his discourse by inviting all Christians present to rise. And he made that plea several times. And no matter what, Bonnet stuck to his seat. One of the colporteurs knocked on his door and was going to sell him one of the books. But when he came back, it was a bait and switch. He basically sold them 3. He basically got cajoled into purchasing 3 of the studies in the scriptures at once. So he took it. He promised to buy it. And when he read it, it touched his heart, and he got very, very interested. The next snippet there says that he went to the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. That's actually where the first International Bible Students Convention was at that World's Fair. That's where he met Charles Taze Russell, and he was baptized there as well. At the time, Russell put out a request for a stenographer. That interested Bonnet, so he went to a school to get trained for that. In the third snippet there on the right, it says that his employers offered him a lot of money to stay, but he decided to keep his word to Russell instead. He promised him that he would come and do some service at headquarters in Allegheny, and he did in 1895. His company offered him a lot of money to stay, but he kept his promise. He kept his word. So in the first clipping there on the left, it says that while serving for the Watchtower, he slipped and strained one of his ligaments, and that forced him to go home back to his parents to recover. And he thought, why did this happen to me? But he ended up bringing his family into the Watchtower Society. That's why we see his father's death notice in the paper later on in 1927. And in the clipping on the right, this statement is enlightening because Bonnet knew enough about the finances and the financial pitfalls of the Watchtower, and he was able to get training from the company he left in regards to financial matters for 8 years in Washington, D.C. Watchtower were having some money trouble. He left, went to another business back at the old business he was working at, but this time in D.C., and he learned some new skills when he was there. So in 1909, when Watchtower moved their headquarters to Brooklyn, Bonnet remained behind in Allegheny, and he looked after the Watchtower Farm and those cemetery plots. And that, as we said, we've discussed previously.
And here it shows not just Rutherford took talented people, but Russell, gathered people who had different skills. But he did it Russell did it in a more like, let's bring the best out of everybody, not to exploit anyone. Everything I've read about Russell and comments made by other people just show a night and day contrast of the two people.
Yeah, even the Watchtower history videos make definite mention about the distinction between the characters of the two men. And they admit Rutherford's bold, brash, abrasive behavior.
2 months after Russell's death, Joseph Rutherford was appointed to oversee the work. Rutherford had been a close associate of Russell, traveling with him and speaking in his defense. Like Russell, he believed that the good news had to be preached. He was dynamic and could not be intimidated. Yet not everyone appreciated these traits, even among the Bible students.
Brother Rutherford, he was an entirely different personality, brusque in manner, and he didn't fear to tread on anyone's toes. I think this had a tremendous test on the brothers.
So Bonnet actually went and visited Benjamin Wilson, who authored the emphatic diaglott. And I have an original one here, one of the early ones that the Watchtower printed. I think this page here wasn't reprinted in later editions. It's a friendly criticism because there are things in it that they didn't quite agree with. Wilson was associated with the Church of God of the Abrahamic faith. And Wilson and Benjamin Marsh were the most prominent writers of their magazine. The Restitution, and we've discussed this paper from time to time, that Restitution paper was the official paper of their movement. They had a couple of papers before that. One was the Gospel Banner, and the other one was the Herald of the Kingdom. And they merged and they renamed it as the Restitution. In 1921, there was a split with one group holding to Wilson's ideas and another group with another idea. And the Restitution stopped publishing in 25. The new splinter group published a new paper called the Restitution Herald. So kind of continued with almost the same name. And that paper is actually still published today.
Now, on a side note here, if you follow the splinter groups and from around, even prior to the Bible students forming, all those older people who learned Adventism and started coming up and putting pieces of the puzzle together, they all kind of drifted apart with each other and had different idea, whether it be the ransom or whatnot. And you wonder if Rutherford himself, just part of their whole thing with unity was nothing more than a self-preservation tactic, that if we don't have unity, people are going to have their own ideas and we're going to be a smaller organization. And not that being a large organization should be a consideration for a little flock or a true church. But it seems that did instill a key idea of them, of this unity, is to avoid splinter groups and separation and become one large entity, corporation.
Well, it had to be, in Rutherford's day, of course, we've discussed this a lot, it had to be Rutherford's ideas. Mm-hmm. And the unity was a forced unity. But
exactly. And if it wasn't a unity, there would be splinters. And like I said, he was just trying to prevent that from happening. And once again, for the control.
And in that early Watchtower movement, they were very open to other ideas. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of different people of different ideas and thoughts mixed in between. And I've been doing a lot of research as to where the ideas where did the ideas come from that Russell had? So actually yesterday evening, I had a small interview with a pastor of an Advent Christian church, and his father wrote a book called The Origin and Development of the Advent Christian Church Denomination. His father's passed away now, but very, very interesting discussion, very enlightening, helped fill in some of the gaps of some of the history that I was looking to fill. And they're still around today. A lot of the famous names that we've read before were preachers in the Advent Christian Church, like George Stetson, Jonas Wendell, for example, Rufus Wendell. Yeah, George Storrs was more involved on the fringes of the movement. We hope to do some Watchtower style history deep dives into those periods and those individuals in future discussions, and also to look at the claims of the modern Watchtower when they talk about these people. Some interesting things there that we just recently discovered. But as we say, a future discussion for another time. Bonnet was a salesman. That was part of his job at the companies that he worked for, and he was good at it. This is why at the 1905 Niagara Falls Convention, Russell puts him in charge of explaining how to sell the books. It lays out the groundwork for his background in sales and trying to make money. That was part of his makeup, part of his business, part of what he knew how to do best. And so this sets the background for that. I wonder how much of this he learned from his sales experience or from the guy who sold him 3 Millennial Dawn series instead of just one. So how much was learned by his experience or by his
now I will say this, as history has shown, the Bible students in Russell's day were more concerned with you reading the books, not just selling them. Those were actually real learning tools. And why I'm going to state this, Jeff, is because what Russell did was he produced books, thought out, here's what our thoughts are, whereas the society afterward became a book publisher. And every week, every 2 weeks, there was something new to sell and read, when they could have just basically kept several things on a subject, very detailed, to explain their interpretations with. But they didn't do that. They were to continually sell books. Whereas you can see from history, Russell, did he put out other periodicals? Yes, he started the Watchtower. But he also had some core books and what they were trying to get through here. The society's material today is repeating everything over and over again, whereas Russell, it was elaborating and expanding.
But the difference between what Russell taught, and that's why that Second Advent movement, Christian Church, is very interesting, because what he taught came out of a lot of other movements. He didn't just even invent something new. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you get to Rutherford's period, they become salesmen and they have to sell something new all the time. And all the doctrine becomes something new that's unique only to Watchtower itself. You don't find it in any other denominations.
And that's what makes us the chosen ones.
We're the chosen ones because only we have this truth since 1919. And I went to prison, so it's all about me, right? Like Rutherford said, we, of course, discussed that in our sheep and the goats discussion. If you haven't seen that, make sure you go and take a click on that. That's very, very interesting discussion. Okay, so Bonnet is also one who published his own book. Bonnet published a book called Features of the Plan of God, set forth in exclusively scripture compilation. 25 cents. But it was a compilation of scriptures or scriptural subjects. And you see some of the older literature, they do some of the same things. So here's answering questions, which is very similar. Thy Word is Truth. They're basically just lists of scriptures. They're Make Sure of All Things book. And they take various subjects, and just list out scriptures underneath. And this was redone later and retitled. Instead of just Make Sure of All Things, it was Make Sure of All Things, Hold Fast to What is Fine. And these books basically became the reasoning book.
The difference between the two was one was actually showing what the scriptures were. The reasoning book seemed to be more written how to overcome objections when
Yeah.
you're talking to people at their door.
Instead of just listing out the scriptures and letting you reason it out yourself,
We'll reason it out for you.
yeah, you don't have to think for yourself anymore. So in the March 15th, 1908 Watchtower, Russell publishes an article about miracle wheat. And it's basically a lot of quotations from various newspapers and what they said about it. The basic idea is that they were looking for articles in the press that they thought proved that the natural physical world was being restored to what it was like in Eden. And this is a sample, or this is exactly the kind of thing that they were looking for. And there's a follow-up to
The
it.
irony of that is, Jeff, is as they were looking for these super strains of wheat and this and that, they were actually kind of having an adverse effect on things. Like, for instance, in the area I was from in New York, growing out in some of these fields and rare yards and farms and whatnot were strains of apples and varieties that didn't do as well commercially. So they basically, in their quest for growth and everything, did a disservice to nature rather than let everything just keep going its natural course.
And we'll get into that in a little bit because we're going to look at the USDA report on miracle wheat. That is something very, very interesting. So in the October 1st, 1908, there was a follow-up to the miracle wheat as well. And this would have been it. This would have been the end of the story, except Bonnet pushed the matter further.